How many of you feel like this? I completely understand. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to manage the mess in your historiographic projects. Okay, someone help me get out of this and let's get going. Let's start by doing a quick review and making sure you know what the main phases and steps of the historiographic project are. Let's start with the three main phases of the project. The first is research. This means determining a topic and gathering sources on that topic. You should pretty much be done with this phase now. The second phase is analysis. This is when you read the sources and start to synthesize what you've read. This is what you should be in the thick of at this moment, and this is the phase we're going to talk about in this video. The third and final phase, of course, is just writing. This is simply taking all the work you've done and communicating it clearly in written assignments. More on this next week. But let's break all this down a little more. Here's our project checklist. Here are all the things that you need to do to complete the historiographic project. We've already covered a lot of these, and you should be well on your way through much of this list by now. I haven't shown the check marks here, but we'll go over those in class. What I want to focus on, though, is the middle section of the checklist. There are 3 steps here that are important for what we're going to discuss today. The first is identify your core source. Let's remind ourselves what a core source is. Okay, you remember what a beachhead source is, right? That's one of the first sources that you've found. It's an article, usually, that's right on the topic that you've chosen. Beachhead sources are useful because they lead you into the specific historiographic debate that you're going to write about. You should definitely already have this and have used it to expand your bibliography and track down a debate. A core source, as you may remember, is a source to which all or most of your other sources respond. It's one of the most important sources in the historiographic debate. It's the one, or ones, there can be a few, that everyone talks about and cites and footnotes and argues with, etc. These are the most important sources for your historiographic projects because they're the ones that have shaped the debate in the most significant ways. They're also the ones that you use to do comparisons. When you're discussing how historian X is different from everyone else, it's usually advantageous to compare historian X's piece to some core source. This is what Brundage recommends, and I recommend it too. Identifying core sources is the first step for managing the mess. Once you identify core sources, you know which sources you're really going to need to pour into the most and understand the best. It thus guides the way that you go about reading all the rest of your sources. It also helps you start to paint a picture of the shape of the historiographic debate. More on this later. Look now at the next step. That's simply to Thomas your sources. Nothing complicated here. We've talked about this a bunch. You know how to do it. Now just go and do it. Okay, but now look at the step right below that. Identify your representative sample. This is something I've mentioned in class before, but I want to take more of a closer look at it here. Critical mass, if you can remember, is the state at which you've found just about every source in your historiographic debate. But the reality is that you're not going to write about every single source that you found. Rather, you're going to need to select sources that are representative of the many ways that historians have approached a topic, the many perspectives that they've had, and the ways that perspectives and arguments have changed over time. To do that, you need to identify a handful of sources to make up a representative sample. That's what we're going to figure out how to do next. The analysis phase really is the most challenging phase in the entire historiographic project, but there are ways to get through it efficiently and effectively. And now, to explain a little more, we're going to turn to the wise and sage counsel of an ostrich. Okay, see how that goes.
Wait, what am I supposed to do? I don't know anything about
Never mind. Guess I'll do it. In this next part, I'm going to help you figure out how to break down all of your sources and figure out which ones to use in your representative sample. Thomas, our old friend. This is our method for reading books, articles, and essays. The first task of analysis is simply to Thomas all of the sources that you've found. Now, in doing that, you might figure out a few important things. First, there are some elements of Thomas that are going to be the same or very similar among all or most of your sources. Since, for example, you're focusing on one specific historiographical debate, the H of Thomas should be roughly the same for all of your sources. In fact, if you're struggling to figure out a way to filter through a huge lump of sources that you found, doing so by putting sources together based on the historiographical debates that they engage in is really the main way. You'll end up writing about only one historiographical debate. That's it. So the H should be pretty much the same for everything you write about. Similarly, the T will often be roughly the same, or at least really similar. Different historians will focus on slightly different aspects of a topic, but remember, you chose the topic originally, so the topic should be pretty much shared by all the sources you've found while researching that topic. The main differences in your sources, or the ones that will matter the most, will come through the A and M, and as a result will kind of play into the S. This is where historians writing on the same topic and engaging in the same historiographical debate distinguish themselves. They will advance new and different arguments about the topic, and they'll take on new and different methodologies, new approaches. So in comparing your sources with each other, the first thing you'll do is look to see how their arguments and methodologies differ. So why is this important? Because the differences in argument and methodology are key to organizing a historiographic debate effectively. For remember, the main object of your analysis is the debate itself. Your historiographic essay is not simply going to be a series of article or book reviews. Rather, you're going to tell me about a debate, the main arguments and questions brought to a specific historical topic. The debate is how historians agree and disagree with each other on the topic. Remember our original definition of history that we discussed at the beginning of the semester, that history is a dynamic process. It's not simply one thing. Historians disagree all the time and take different approaches and perspectives to topics. It's in these differences that you'll find the contents of the historiographic debate. But debates are not simply comprised of individuals all saying totally different things. Rather, historians can often be grouped together in what we might call schools of thought, or historiographical camps. These schools, or camps, are essentially shared methodologies or shared arguments. They consist of groups of historians with shared perspectives on the topic that you've chosen. And how do you distinguish what these camps are? Well, look at the A and the M. Historians with similar arguments, comprise usually a unique school of thought. Similarly, historians with similar methodologies do the same. That's how you end up describing the historiographic debate, as a conversation between a few general schools of thought or a few general historiographic camps, each comprised of individual historians with individual arguments and approaches that you articulate in more detail. And this gets us back to the representative sample. So what is a representative sample? It is the 10 or so sources that you're really going to write about in your assignments. But a representative sample is not simply 10 random sources. You need to choose wisely when it comes to making up your sample. Here are my tips on how to do that effectively. First, identify your core sources. They are inevitably works that you will want to include in your representative sample because they are, by definition, the ones that have had the greatest impact on the historiographical debate. Your task is just to figure out why. That's what you'll explain in the annotated bibliography and eventually the historiographic essay itself. Second, think through the schools of thought or the historiographical camps and make sure that you have at least one or two sources from every school of thought that you've identified. The point of a representative sample is that it is a collection of sources that represent the whole debate. So you have to choose sources that represent each historiographic camp and do justice to the camp's main arguments or methodologies. Third, and finally, you need to include sources in your representative sample that provide and showcase the chronological breadth of your project. You're going to choose how much of the historiography you want to cover. For some topics, the historiography is small and you'll just do all of it. For other topics, however, for example, like ancient history topics, historians have been writing about it for probably thousands of years. You can't cover thousands of years of historical writing in a 10-page paper for a 2000 level class. You have to choose how much of the chronology you want to cover. The one thing that I require is that you do get to contemporary scholarship. In other words, you need to get up to the present in your analysis. That's because the main purpose of a historiographic project is usually to determine the state of the scholarship on a topic and how it got to be what it is so that you can then add to that by doing your own original research. For this reason, you always need to come up to the present in a historiographic analysis. But where you choose to begin is up to you. Now that you've broken things apart, let's figure out how to put them back together. And for this, I'm going to turn now to an Arctic seal. Are you sure? It's a seal? That's okay. Let's give it a shot. Ridiculous. Totally unhelpful. Organizing a debate is about identifying sources for what they are, what their arguments are, and what their methodologies are, then putting them together into groups, and finally, talking about and discussing how those groups emerged and how they interact with each other and compare with each other. That's the final element of your analysis. Once you've found all your sources, written up Thomas worksheets for them, and figured out your historiographical camps and representative sample, you're ready to think about how to organize and present all of this. Like articles, essays, and other academic works, historiographic essays tend to take on one of two main organizations. The first is chronological. Chronological organization reveals how the historiography has changed over time. In lots of historiographic debates, one of the best ways of describing the changes that have occurred is just to trace the debate through the years and decades and show new developments, new arguments, new methodologies as they appeared. Take, for example, a topic that I've written about, the Enlightenment. There have been a lot of debates about the Enlightenment, but one of the biggest has simply revolved around the question of what the Enlightenment was exactly. In the 1950s, intellectual historians basically saw it as an intellectual crisis and a transformation of the whole of European culture, a turning point where the mentalities of all Europeans changed, and they adopted reason over tradition and secularism. In the 1960s, Peter Gay and others began to think that the movement of secularism and reason over tradition was really actually confined mostly to a few elite, mostly French, philosophers or philosophes, whose writings inspired the movement to freedom. In the 1980s, the historiographic debate changed again when Roy Porter and Michaela Teich published a book in which they suggested, and others followed, that the Enlightenment actually looked really different in different parts of Europe. That opened up historians to saying in the 1990s that there wasn't really one Enlightenment, but rather many Enlightenments, diverse movements that shared some commonalities, but on the whole had really different features. Then, by the 21st century, historians began exploring other differences than geographic ones. The historiography really splits here, and I'm not going to cover it all, but in brief, people start suggesting that proponents of the Enlightenment in fact incorporated a wide range of ideas, including even religious ones. David Sorkin wrote about a religious enlightenment of clergymen of various religious communities, all promoting their religious identities while also pursuing the intellectual agenda of the Enlightenment. That fragmentation has continued into the last decade of scholarship, where we see even more variety within religious communities and their responses to the Enlightenment. For example, varieties in what historians now call the Catholic Enlightenment. This is a lot, and you don't need to know all of this, really. The main point is to show you how one describes historiography once it's organized. As you'll see, most of the differences here stem from differing arguments, and those arguments sort of came about through the course of time, in different moments in time. One final note and reminder. You need to make sure that you cover an entire chronology, whatever that chronology is. This means that you must analyze works throughout the chronological spectrum, as I mentioned before. This will ensure that you're actually covering the debate adequately. So, for my example, I was covering the historiography of the Enlightenment from the 1950s until today. I could have zoomed in and done the historiography since the 1980s. I could have chosen whatever frame I wanted. Whatever the frame is, it's important to just remember that you have to show the changes that happen throughout that entire chronology. You have to show what transformations have taken place from the beginning of when you start all the way to the present. The second main way to organize a historiographic debate is to organize it thematically. Sometimes it's not so simple as just walking through time. Sometimes historiographical camps emerge at roughly the same time, or it's better to think through these camps by tackling them in their respective groups. For while schools of thought often come in and out of popularity at certain moments of time, they're not necessarily associated with certain moments in time. Take, for example, another historiographical field that I know fairly well, the origins of the French Revolution. Lots of historians have discussed what caused the revolution. Ask my students in History 4333. They'll tell you a lot about it. And while we can describe the historiography through time, in fact, one of the better ways of thinking about it is thematically. There are, for example, historians who have emphasized social and economic factors in bringing about the revolution. Marxist historians of the 1950s and 60s dominated this historiography and described the French Revolution as the result of class conflict. While Marxism was increasingly challenged throughout time, socioeconomic explanations never really went away. Eventually, they expanded to include analyses of social conflicts devoid of class and economic conflicts that didn't fall neatly into the categories that Marxists used of bourgeois and proletariat and aristocracy. Conversely, there have always been political arguments, too, about the French Revolution and its origins. Originally, they revolved around the clash of ideas, old regime ideas of absolutism versus new ideas of democracy from the Enlightenment. Eventually, though, that historiography expanded and began to focus on the clash of political institutions, like the royal courts fighting back against the crown. Beginning in the 1970s, another group of arguments emerged that came in with the advent of cultural history. Some historians took the notion that ideas caused the French Revolution, but then started to look at which ideas, precisely, did the most harm by investigating the culture of printing and book ownership and media. Cultural historians continued to push that it was less ideas and more cultural norms that clashed in the 18th century, everything from norms about gender to norms about customs and local particularities. The linguistic turn brought about historians who would argue that it was about meaning, really, and about the use of certain types of language that brought about the French Revolution. Again, you don't need to know all the specifics of this. Well, you do if you take my other class, but rather, this is all an example to just show you how historiography can be broken down and then repackaged in ways that make sense and clearly show the variations of a debate. So, the end result is you have one of these two basic structures. If you're presenting the historiography chronologically, then you're going to begin at the date you've chosen and move through time all the way to the present. And within each segment, you'll analyze individual historians from that period and focus on what they contributed that was new. Alternatively, you could approach things thematically. In sections or sets of paragraphs, you might take on one general explanation for a phenomenon. Then, you'd generally go chronologically through those sources within that school of thought or historiographical camp. Next, you'd move to the second school of thought or the second historiographical camp and move through that chronologically. And then on to the third and fourth and fifth and however many you've gotten. But the fact remains the same. These are both totally legitimate ways to organize, to think about, and to repackage the historiography so that it makes sense and so that your analysis comes through. Okay, now you know how to approach the sources that you found and how to organize them effectively. So, to finish off, we're going to go to... Seriously, again? Okay, forget it. Why not? A grizzly bear.
The reality is that historiography is a particular topic that's quite complicated. What historians have said about the topic that you've chosen to focus on might not work as cleanly as the examples in this video. In fact, the best tip is simply to follow what the historians you're reading have said on the matter. If they have described the shape of the historiography themselves and discussed how it has changed over time, then follow their lead. Use the categories that they develop, just like how you use the sources they mention in their footnotes and endnotes. The job is not to invent something new, but rather to describe, to the best of your ability, what is out there and how professional historians have interacted with each other.
Wow, that was actually really great advice, Bear. Thanks.
You're very welcome, Professor Watkins. Happy to do my part. You know, you can always trust a bear.
Okay, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Good job, keep working hard, and I'll see you in class.